Started, okay.
Hello, my name is Eitan Perlin, and my research has to deal with World War II from the American perspective. So, World War II is considered one of the worst wars in history. A lot of tragic events occurred and millions of people died, but I think it's important to always consider things from multiple perspectives and play a bit of devil's advocate for this and say that America did greatly benefit from this war, and it helped with a lot of issues it was having. It brought us out of the Great Depression with the economy, it advanced science a lot, and it gave us a lot more influence on the global scale. Now, some cons were all the moral travesties that happened during this time, but that's very subjective, and I'll get into that later. So, in the economy, the main things that the war benefited were the GDP, the workforce, and women's rights. So, the GDP of America at the beginning of the war started at the largest, at about 800 billion, which is a lot. And then over the course of the war, it nearly doubled to almost 15 billion. Meanwhile, all the other nations during this time were either stagnant, had slight increase or slight decrease. So this war really brought America a lot more money and more influence in that regard. One of the reasons that the GDP was so beneficial relative to others is that the war didn't take place on America, so other countries' capital, both human and land, were being destroyed, and it gave us an unfair advantage. Another was the workforce. So in this war, about 400,000 soldiers died, and that's terrible, but what that meant for the workforce is that there were fewer people competing. And if you know anything about the laws of supply and demand, that meant that the wages for the people who remained and the job availability went way up because there was actually a labor shortage. So unions also got stronger during the war because they needed more protection. There were more workers. By the end of the war, about 35% of workers were in unions. There were 14.5 million people under their protection. Another major economic boon that the war gave America was women's rights. So during the war, most of the men were either drafted, gone, or otherwise occupied. So there was a huge upsurge for what women could do, which was defending the home front by making weapons, by keeping things stable. And after the war, they were expected to go back, but a lot of them refused, and what they got out of that was a lot of new job opportunities. Like they could work in steel mills, they could drive cars, they could do all these things that had previously only been men-driven jobs, and they always paid better, and this was a huge advantage to get out of the pink-collar work that women were made to do before. So another major benefit for America was the scientific aspect. So this science in wartime is generally improved because while there is a lot of war that's being fought on the battlefield, in the laboratories and the information war, there's a lot more going on because it's all about who can develop better weapons, who can keep their soldiers better kept. So the main things that came out of World War II for science was nuclear science, better medicine, and other miscellaneous inventions. So the Manhattan Project was the largest project for science ever. $2 billion were poured into it, and 120,000 people were employed, which is a very, very large employment base. It was about, you could argue that based on that alone, a fifth of the people involved in the war were scientists, people working on the science project, which is immense. It was really, really significant, top minds all over the world. So what came out of this was nuclear discoveries. Now, nuclear discoveries have three major implications. There were nuclear weapons, there was nuclear medicine, and there was nuclear energy. So the nuclear weapon was devastating, and it could essentially firebomb towns a lot more effectively, which is what it did, because it wasn't even the worst bombing in history. That was Dresden. But it was very, very important, and what nuclear weapons did was they created mutually assured destruction, which has kept America out of any major confrontations with other major powers in modern history, which is very important because it's allowed us to grow in other ways. Nuclear energy is also very good because it's a cleaner form, and despite a lot of negative connotations about it, it generally doesn't cause much background radiation, and as long as you have the proper precautions, it's fine, and it's a lot better than a lot of other options at the moment. And nuclear medicine is generally good for diagnostics. It's PET and SPECT scans, which have enabled doctors to really diagnose certain things like tumors a lot more effectively and really improve their ability to treat them. So the other medicines besides the nuclear medicine that was developed out of World War II were antibiotics. Now, antibiotics had existed before, but there was never really a need for them to be mass-produced until there were soldiers. So with the penicillin that they mass-produced, people on the home front also benefited because they got the benefits of being able to cure gonorrhea and syphilis and all these other diseases that previously had just been ailments bothering people. My grandmother actually was treated by penicillin at the time, and it was a brand new research opportunity, and it was really interesting to hear talk about that. Another thing that came out were perfected blood transfusions, which helped soldiers deal with the blood loss of being shot more effectively, and that's beneficial for a lot of surgical procedures now because that had been a limiting factor before because they would die of blood loss. There were also the inventions like a radar, jet engines, computer, and the synthetic oil and rubbers, and as we all know, computers are very, very important today, and they've enabled humankind to do amazing things like go to the moon, and the first one came out of the war. In terms of power, the American Army started out very, very small, but by the end of the war, it was actually the largest, and today it is still the largest army, which gives it a lot of sphere of influence in the global scale. So then there are the cons, of course, which are that hundreds of thousands of people died in the war, even Americans, and there was the Japanese bombings in Hawaii. And another negative was the military-industrial complex. Now, I said that the war became the largest, and that gives us a lot of influence, but it's also a bit of a problem because today a large portion of our budget is spent on the military while we're still experiencing other problems with healthcare, education, and welfare, and all sorts of things that are not being addressed. But the budget for the military is currently upwards of $500 billion, and the second highest is China's, which is under 300 billion. So it's nowhere near as close, and we're not even enemies. So it's kind of a drain on resources that's preventing America from growing further because we kind of got stuck in this obsession with being the most powerful. So in my conclusion, World War II was overall beneficial for America. It increased our economy, it increased our science, and it increased our sphere of influence in the world. And I think that people often underestimate that, and it needs to be considered more if you're looking at things from more perspectives. And these are my works cited that I used for research. You can't read that on the poster. Yeah.
Nice. Okay.
10 seconds.
All right, nice. All right, Mr. Aitan, what evidence have you gathered when you were doing your research that you chose not to use, and why?
I chose not to include my research about the education during this time because it was very, very long, very in-depth, and I was running out of space in my presentation. But what's important to know about the education is that a lot of it was being dominated by propaganda, and it wasn't preparing the children adequately for the world. It was mainly making them workers for the factories that needed to be done. And children, there are stories of children who would spend all their free time instead of playing, they would look around for scrap metal to help the war front. And it was a huge impact on their psyches later as they developed.
Huh. All right. If you had more time to continue researching, what direction would you go?
I would absolutely go in that direction with the children, the people who grew up, and the mental drain it had on the entire generation, both in the war and growing up in it.
Okay, thank you.